Hi, my name is Kelp, and this is the Lion of Poetry. Today we celebrate the great American poet, the self-proclaimed Bard of Democracy, Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman's groundbreaking work, Leaves of Grass, was published in 1855. In 1985, 130 years later, just after we were married, my wife and I went into a used bookstore, and with a small portion of our wedding money, we purchased a couple of interesting books, and one of them was this volume of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, with a stylized cloth cover and beautiful illustrations. The poem I'd like to read to you from Leaves of Grass is really the main poem of that volume, his most famous poem. It's also a very long poem. We won't have, in this episode, the experience of reciting a poem in its entirety. I'm going to read you several excerpts from the Song of Myself. Before we begin, I just want to emphasize the significance of this episode following last episode on Wordsworth. In a certain sense, my own opinion, no Wordsworth, no Whitman. Wordsworthian romanticism certainly had a huge influence on American romanticism, which became known as transcendentalism and was expressed in Whitman and the philosophy of Ralph Waldo Emerson, specifically in his essay called Nature. In fact, when Whitman came out with Leaves of Grass, in 1855, there was mixed criticism. Many people found it offensive, but one of his defenders in the critical sphere was Ralph Waldo Emerson, who championed Whitman as a truly new voice and an authentically American voice. So the poem Song of Myself begins like this. Part 1. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood, formed from this soil, this air, born here of parents, born here from parents the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health, begin, hoping to cease not till death. The whole idea of a song of myself, I think, is very American. One of the great accomplishments in Whitman's life is his ability to create himself as a kind of mythic figure. He had a long beard, and he was called the Old Gray Beard in his older age, and he created a persona of himself as the American poet. He drew on the great American traditions. America, with all respect to Canada, revolted against England, declared its independence, and from the very beginning, there was a kind of independent free spirit that permeated the American identity, individualism. There's also a sense of democracy when he says, for every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. As much as I'm an individualist, as much as I'm special, we're all special. The metaphor of leaves of grass is a good one because each leaf of grass is unique and is beautiful in its own right, but we see it only in a field of grass amongst many, many leaves of grass. There's a kind of a double edge to the American dream here. On the one hand, we have this idea of individualism, as I've said. On the other hand, he's loafing on the grass. He's not exactly representing the Protestant work ethic here. One could interpret it that way. On the other hand, from this loafing on the grass, he is able to create an entire volume of poetry. Perhaps loafing on the grass is his way of working hard to find the American dream. Walt Whitman was the father of free verse. Now, free verse is a type of verse that does not rhyme. It doesn't conform to any meter or any kind of style. It's not unlike prose, except there's a concentration of ideas here that make it poetry. If you recall with Wordsworth, his poems were also a kind of free verse. We call it blank verse. So his verses did not rhyme, but there was a certain meter to his verses. With Whitman, there's no rhyme, there's no meter. It's kind of a stream of consciousness. And again, I would say that that is an American thing. The idea that we can just have the freedom to speak without holding back and create from that speech a form of art. I'm now skipping to part 6, which is one of the most famous parts of the poem and one of the most beautiful. A child said, "What is the grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. How can I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. Or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and remembrancer designedly dropped, bearing the owner's name some way in the corners, that we may see and remark and say, whose? Or I guess the grass is itself a child, the produce babe of the vegetation. Or I guess it is a uniform hieroglyphic, and it means sprouting alike in broad zones and narrow zones, growing among black folks as among white. Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman, Cuff, I give them the same, I receive them the same. And now it seems to me the beautiful uncut hair of graves. Tenderly will I use you, curling grass. It may be you transpire from the breasts of young men. It may be if I had known them, I would have loved them. It may be you are from old people or from offspring taken soon out of their mother's laps. And here you are, the mother's laps. The smallest sprout shows there is really no death. And if ever there was, it led forward life and does not wait at the end to arrest it. And ceased the moment life appeared. All goes onward and outward. Nothing collapses. And to die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier. It's interesting that he calls it a flag of his disposition. And, Americans love flags, but a flag is something that is a symbol. It represents what he's feeling. Sprouting alike in broad zones and narrow zones, growing among black folks as among white. Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman, Cuff, I give them the same and I receive them the same. Whitman is showing a sort of brotherhood between white and black, between Native Americans and all types of people that live in this big country, treating them all equally in a democratic spirit. Wordsworth wrote a poem called Ode Intimations on Immortality, where in death, a person will become one with nature. Whitman really picks up on this. He sees in nature the source of his immortality. Walt Whitman says, the smallest sprout shows that there really is no death. And he's convinced that he is immortal and that all people are immortal because they're born and reborn in the cycles of nature. Chapter 52 of the poem, I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. So we have this immortal bard, the immortal poet, who's going to be following you even after he's dead, through nature and through his poems. We see in part 10 this beautiful episode of a runaway slave that Whitman takes care of. We see his compassion for all humanity, irrespective of race. The runaway slave came to my house and stopped outside. I heard his motions crackling the twigs and the wood pile. Through the swung half door of the kitchen, I saw him limpsy and weak, and went where he sat on a log and let him in and assured him, and brought water and filled the tub for his sweated body and bruised feet, and gave him a room that entered from my own, and gave him some coarse, clean clothes, and remember perfectly well his revolving eyes and his awkwardness, and remember putting plasters on the galls of his neck and ankles. He stayed with me a week before he was recuperated, and passed north. I had him sit next to me at table. My firelock leaned in the corner. So here we see a very sympathetic Walt Whitman to the anti-slavery movement. The image of him caring for this runaway slave, of treating his wounds, this must have been shocking for many of his readers back in 1855. Biographically, Walt Whitman worked in a hospital for wounded soldiers during the Civil War. He certainly had a lot of experience with first aid and medical care. Whitman was a tremendous admirer of Abraham Lincoln, and he wrote a couple of poems about Lincoln, most notably, "O Captain, My Captain," which was made famous in the movie Dead Poets Society with Robin Williams, and "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed." Both of these poems are elegies to Abraham Lincoln, and they show Whitman's admiration and love of Lincoln as a great leader because of his stance against slavery. Part 24. Walt Whitman, a cosmos of Manhattan, the sun, turbulent, fleshy, sensual, eating, drinking, and breeding, no sentimentalist, no stander above men and women or apart from them, no more modest than immodest. Through me, many long, dumb voices, voices of the interminable generation of prisoners and slaves, voices of the diseased and despairing and of thieves and dwarfs, voices of cycles of preparation and accretion. Through me, forbidden voices, voices of sexes and lusts, voices veiled, and I remove the veil, voices indecent, by me clarified and transfigured. Whitman does not shy away from sensuality. He embraces it. He is a man of appetite. Talking about the voices of sexes and lusts, you can imagine how revolutionary this was in its time in the mid-1800s. We also see here stylistically his repetition, voices of the interminable generation, voices of the diseased, voices of cycles, sort of an encyclopedic listing of one thing after another, using the same word over and over again. We're going to see other poets will pick up on that kind of repetition, for example, the beat poets, which we'll see very soon in a future episode. I'll finish with this from part 51. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. By the way, Bob Dylan, in his most recent album, Bob Dylan, the Nobel Prize winner, wrote a song called I Contain Multitudes, which he picks up directly from this line in Whitman. But I think this summarizes the scope of Whitman's vision when he says, I contain multitudes. What matters here is the force of my personality in the world, my ability to express myself and to show my love for my fellow humans. And this is really the promise, in many ways, of America. It's the promise of a land where everyone can find a way to express themselves. Everyone has the ability to chase down their own dreams and find their own dreams. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time on The Lion of Poetry.